We're getting near the end. This chapter, chapter 11, called Integrating Presentation Media, is one that typically uh, only applies to our work in a classroom. I've told you before that for the informative and persuasive speech, I ask you to do uh, a PowerPoint or Prezi, some kind of on-screen presentation, not using video. Although this chapter talks about using video, and there are times when, in fact, you may need to do that. And as I've said any number of times before, there may come a day when you find yourself at work, probably, uh, you need to give a talk. You need to explain something to your coworkers or to your boss, or you're trying to get a promotion, whatever it may be. And you'll need to use some kind of media in your presentation. Now, as you're going to see here, media can apply to anything from there's a um, cardio dummy on the floor to slideshows to poster boards. All of this is considered media. I really like the picture. I guess my yes, I really like the picture of this old professor. Somehow I identify with this guy. For many, many years, I used a slide projector, and they were very effective. And you could do all kinds of interesting things with two, three, four slide projectors. We did some wonderful stuff, but it was still very restrictive. The current technology for integrating media into any kind of presentation is really pretty fantastic when it comes right down to it. And what I'm doing right now is a good example. Simple slideshow with me down in the corner doing a video. So, anyway, let me get started here. All right, so I've already talked about this. Uh, the presentation media, and I'll say this again, one of the real benefits of using presentation media is it helps your listeners visualize and understand what you're talking about better. I hope you watched my presentation, All That Glitters, my informative gold speech, both with just me presenting the speech and then my PowerPoint with the speech. Which do you think was more effective? I personally think when you can do a speech like that using media, it really is more effective. So yeah, here's different things you can use: PowerPoint, Prezi, Keynote. That's you for those of you who are Mac users, you find that flip charts. Sure, you're in a presentation at work, and you just use a flip chart. Music, perhaps handouts. All these things are considered media. All right, kind of said this already, haven't I? Draws attention to the topic. It helps reinforce the topic. It illustrates your ideas, maybe through graphs or images of some kind. Gets an emotional reaction. Let's say you're talking about global warming and its effect on the Arctic, and you show a picture, and many of you may have seen images like this, of a stranded polar bear on an ice floe. That certainly is an example of eliciting an emotional reaction. You could describe that all day, but to see the picture of it makes a huge difference. I've had a lot of presentations over the years about uh, rescuing animals and those heartbreaking pictures of cats and dogs in cages that we don't call them the pound anymore, the shelter, but they used to be called the pound. Uh, is heartrending. So sure, images can really make an impact in your presentation. All right, emphasizing key points, support your argument, helps audience remembers the main ideas. I think that's the most important part on this slide. It helps people remember exactly what your emphasis is. Uh, Now, before I go any further with this, and this isn't real long, but before I go any further with this, there's a wonderful video on YouTube, which I'm not going to make you watch, but it's called Death by PowerPoint. And as you'll see in these slides in a moment, PowerPoint, uh, whatever you might be using, sometimes the presentation media can overwhelm what you're trying to do. So we'll look at that a little bit more. Ah, there you go. I'm right with it today. So keep it simple. You've I hope you've noticed this in all my presentations. Now, this presentation that I'm using today came with the book. They sent me a whole uh, list of PowerPoints for each chapter. Typically, I prefer making my own PowerPoints, but sometimes I use theirs. And in all of these slideshows that you've seen, I hope you've noticed that I never put a lot of words on any given slide. I try to keep it very simple. I try to only put the key points on there, maybe a quote or a specific reference. Um, and it says here, show what you can't say. How about a graph, for example? But the point is you need to keep your slides or your images as simple as possible. I think it's better to have a lot of slides, each one of them being very simple and easy for the listener and the viewer to digest, than trying to cram a lot of information on any given slide. And I just know you've all been in classroom situations where the instructor has put just huge amounts of information on a single slide. To me, that's useless. It really doesn't serve any purpose at all. Okay, limit the number of images. Again, some examples that I've seen in the past, and I get carried away with images, I do. But one of the things I do allow in class is to put in, is it JPEG? Even I'm getting confused here. The little moving images that you can insert into a slide. Those can be kind of fun, but they can also be incredibly distracting. There was a presentation I had in class about cheerleading. It was an interesting talk. But the last slide, the speaker had put images like 2 or 3 across the top, 2 in the middle, and 2 or 3 across the bottom, and they all had animation and moving. And it was so distracting you forgot that anyone was even talking to you. So again, keep it simple. If you find yourself in a situation where you have to use images, and especially something like PowerPoint, keep what you have on the slide brief and simple. All right, use big letters, absolutely, because people in the back of the room need to be able to see as well. All right. Uh, all right. This is kind of a interesting PowerPoint slide. All right. Let me just go through this. Let me go with the second one here. Plan hardware setup. Uh, if you're, I keep saying, if you're at work and you have to do this, make sure you know what equipment you have and plan for the setup so that when you go in, you're not fumbling around with things. Uh, Develop your speech and presentation at the same time. I'm not sure I wholly agree with this in the book. When I develop presentations, and I've done a lot of them over the years, I still find it useful to sit down and draft an outline. And then I look for images that support what I want to do. Uh, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that you build your speech around the image. Now I say that's my way of going at the idea of developing a presentation. I know in the movie industry, it really is a matter of where maybe you've heard of storyboarding, where they have artists draw out just brief examples of each sequence in a scene so that those are the ones that the camera tries to capture. So I don't know. It kind of depends on what you're doing. But again, for me, I have to have that outline first. I have to know exactly what information I want to deliver in the speech before I worry about the images that might support it. But again, there's different ways to approach this. All right, so using slides to support the speech. Some of this PowerPoint's rather redundant. It says use slides sparingly, and I just said a moment ago it's better to have a lot of slides than put too much on slides, and I'll stand by that. Sometimes I'll do a 6 or 7 minute presentation, and I might have 20 slides in it, but each slide, just as it says in some of these other uh, uh, examples, I keep the slides very simple. I'd rather pace myself through the slides and have only a little bit of information in each slide. So anyway, use slides sparingly. Uh, Balance creativity, clarity, predictability, spontaneity. That sounds a lot like an extemporaneous presentation to me. Even using slides, you still want to make the speech sound spontaneous. Obviously, you've gone to some work to get those slides together, to put your media in preparation for your presentation. But when you're giving that presentation, uh, it still needs to have that extemporaneous spontaneity to it. And then it says avoid relying on text or numbers. Well, I'm not quite sure. This is another one. This is where I would love to sit down and have a beer with the authors of some of these books I've had to use. Um, Obviously, putting key text on a slide is great. And numbers, I can't remember numbers. If I'm giving a 10-minute speech about something that has a lot of data in it, I'm going to put it on the slide. That helps my audience and it helps me. So, again, I understand what their meaning is here by relying, but using text and numbers on your slide can help you and your audience keep pace with exactly what the presentation is about. All right, I've said all of this. Limit the bullet points. And again, just look at my slides. Look at this slide. There's only 4 bullet points on here. Uh, Again, use as few words as possible. Don't put a lot of text on a slide. Make sure that it's readable. And I've often found it interesting in class where I know a student has prepared a PowerPoint or Prezi or something on a computer, just like I'm doing right now, and used a fairly small font type, and it looks fine on the computer. But then when you project it on a big screen, all of a sudden it's tiny. So so don't be fooled by that. Again, if you find yourself in a situation where you're doing something, make it big on the slide, because then it will work when you project it. If you don't, you're liable to end up with this. Let's say you only have the 4 bullet points, but the font is very small. You're going to end up with a lot of empty space on the slide, which I don't like, and it's going to be hard to read. So, in transitions, again, if you're wondering what I'm talking about, look at my gold presentation again, the one with the slides. I have transition slides in there, which only contain images. And I'm still talking, but it's a slide that I put up just, I hate to use the word filler, but basically that's it, or a placeholder. It gives me a chance to continue talking without having a blank screen or having a screen with a lot of text still up there. So I call those transition slides. Sometimes it's just an image or two on a slide. All right, use animation effects wisely. And I've already mentioned, the animated JPEGs that you can put into a slide. Make sure it doesn't become a distraction. Use color well. When I develop my own PowerPoints, and again, you've seen all of my PowerPoints pretty much so far. Sometimes I prefer gray background with white letters. Sometimes a different color. I'll keep going back to the gold because that's the one you've seen most recently. Uh, I didn't want to use a yellow, which might make you think of gold, so I used an orange. Why did I do that? I think yellow is a lot harder on the eyes. The orange that I picked for the background color of the slides and all that glitters is a soft color, but it still evokes the idea of, in this case, gold, that kind of orange yellow color. So I tried to be effective with the colors that I used. Be very careful if you have to use slides to make sure that you don't, and I've done this, that you don't use, say, a dark background and then you use black letters, or you use a color that when projected becomes very difficult to read. All right, then avoid copying websites onto a slide. I just would say never ever copy and paste a website address and put it on a slide. It's meaningless. It's as meaningless on the slide as it is at the bottom of the outlines that I've told you need to do for each speech. The website doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell your audience anything. So don't copy and paste web addresses. All right. Uh, Citing sources orally as you click through the slide. If you have something on the slide, typically you want to actually say, okay, you might say, according to Barron's financial report in 2016, it was right there on the slide, but I still cited it out loud. Uh, and then, of course, you can add citations elsewhere on the slide, but don't put too much on each slide. Include a reference page slide if you make slides available to the list. All right, and again, perhaps you've had teachers who've used PowerPoints and then given you hard copies. I don't know if you've run into that. I haven't seen people do that much anymore, but that was pretty typical even 10 years ago, that you'd go to a lecture and they would distribute pages with maybe 6 smaller images of each slide. I never found that very useful. They're saying you can do that. And if you do that, have a reference slide, kind of like a table of contents to tell people what it is. Uh, I personally think that's an absolute waste of paper and time. But there it is. It's in the book. All right. What else can you use? Well, there's all sorts of things. Now, my wife, who's been teaching a long time, suffers from a phobia. It's called technophobia. She does not like technology very much, but she learns to use it, and she's fine. And you might find, uh, again, I'll break rule number one here. I'm really sorry I keep referring to this, but it's the most likely scenario at work. You know, a few of you may be thinking of going into education. Not as much as people used to, but it still might be. But this is considered media. Uh, Document cameras, in other words, and you've seen this in many, many classrooms that you've been in, where the instructor has a page under a camera and then it's projected onto a screen. Document cameras are great. I don't use them much anymore, but they can be very, very handy. Flip charts, those big charts that as the speaker talks, they just flip it. If you don't have a projector available, then you can use a flip chart. Whiteboards, and every teacher classroom that you've been in has a whiteboard and teacher writes on it. I would if we were in the classroom. Although I have to say I miss chalkboards. The reason being is I would bring to class a box of colored chalk, and especially when I was teaching astronomy and science, and I could illustrate things with different colors as I was talking. You can kind of do that with markers, but it's not as effective. But anyway, all classrooms pretty much have whiteboards now. And in offices, conference rooms, all right, handouts, preparing something and handing it out. If you do that, follow the same guidelines and rules for your handouts as you would for a slide. Don't put a lot on each page. Make the type big and clear and easy to read. And then physical models, like in that very first picture where they had the dummy that you practice CPR on. But there's a little globe right there. That's a physical model. All right. Interactive whiteboards. And these are something that typically you only find in classrooms some corporate boardrooms, that sort of thing. Human assistance? Okay, you need somebody to help you. All right. I'm not sure I consider that integrating media, but just having someone help you. If you do need help and someone's helping you with a presentation, make sure you spend a little bit of time before the presentation so that your efforts are coordinated. All right, video, sound, and music. All right, that's again, uh, if you use video in a presentation, keep it short. How short? I would never use anything more than about 30 seconds long. Why? Because then people begin just watching a video instead of you presenting a speech. You are what people came to listen to, not watching a video. If at work you're asked to do a presentation about some new aspect of whatever's going on in your job, and people come into the little conference room and you hit a button and they just watch a video, then you don't even need to be there, do you? Okay, so keep the video short. And yes, you need to read chapter 11, and they talk about this in more detail. You need to use video that only truly illustrates what you're talking about, and it needs to be brief, it needs to be short, and you only intersperse that into your presentation. Sound and music depends on obviously what the topic is. I had uh, a speech about music therapy once, which was very nice, and the speaker integrated some music into the speech as examples. That worked real well. Of course, real-time websites, where you project it up onto the screen and click, and then overhead projectors. Does anybody use an overhead projector anymore? Maybe. I threw away all my overhead films, that I used to use in class. Those clear plastic sheets that the instructor then puts on the overhead and it projects up. Uh, I think that's a technology that's pretty well gone. But occasionally you run into that. I wouldn't even have the sheets to use anymore. All right, so here I've already talked about this. Use short clips. Uh, Treat the video as a distinct part of your presentation, not the presentation itself. Embed video into digital slides. You can do that. It takes a little bit of learning how to do it. Avoid offensive videos. I would even say avoid offensive slides. Now, I'm not going to go into what's offensive, with the exception of one example. I had a persuasive speech about abortion, and it was an anti-abortion speech. And the speaker thought by showing really gross slides, it would make more of an impact. It backfired. People were more upset and offended by those slides than persuaded by the slides. So it can uh, certainly have that effect. So try to avoid that. Cite the sources. Where is this stuff coming from? If you just play something and you don't say where it came from, it doesn't have much credibility. And that's kind of the same thing. Confirm the clip is legitimate. Tell us where it came from. All right. What else here? What about the space you're working in? At the college, I might teach, I haven't done this in a little while, but I used to teach 5 classes a semester, full load. I never taught in the same room twice. I would go from room to room to room, sometime from campus to campus. And so I had to consider each space and how I was going to react and work in that space. Man, over on the Charleston campus, there was one room that I would be stuck in every now and then that I just despised. The acoustics were bad. There were no windows. The ventilation was noisy. But I very quickly learned to adjust for that. I practice, 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 practice. I've said this on some of the rubrics that I've sent out, that it's pretty obvious when someone does a speech, sets the camera or computer up, and runs it once and just does it off the top of the head. It's really obvious that no practice was involved. It can be as simple, if you're recording something, just watching the recording when you're done to make sure everything worked right. All right. And if it didn't, go back and do it again. Right? If you're going from room to room like I used to do, get there early enough that you can get set up and everything is working. Again, lots of examples of where I have gone in to give a speech somewhere and the audio visual didn't work. I had to have a backup plan where I knew I could give the speech without the visuals if I had to. And then make sure if and I'll say slides here, if you're using something on a screen like slides, don't stand and stare at the screen. Look at your audience. All right. So, and I keep forgetting that at the end of these PowerPoints from the book, they always have these links that don't work. So I should have pulled this slide out. But here's some relevant websites that we're not going to. All right. So look at the book, at least review chapter 11. And then you've got my video here. And unfortunately, we're not going to be integrating any kind of media, whatever it might be, into the last speech, the persuasive speech. It's just too complicated under the current situation. But again, I think most of you will find one day that you have to get up and give a presentation, probably for work, and this will be useful. So there you go. Thank you for listening again, and we'll be talking to you soon.